Okay, so we're going to continue picking up, talking about the various leadership theories. We've talked about trait theories and behavioral theories. We just finished talking about grid theory, and the idea again that the main thing that comes out of that behavioral theories is the idea that there's two core types of behaviors that leaders can exhibit. They can exhibit basically social or concern for people, and they can show initiating structure or focus on tasks. And that broadly speaking, leaders that do both, they show concern for people and concern for getting the job done, are generally the more effective leaders. So now we're going to talk about contingency theories. So these came about in the 1960s and 70s, and these are the first theories that really kind of start talking about that leadership depends on a wider set of factors, that just looking at the behaviors of the leader is missing, again, the element of what about the situation the leader is in. And just looking at the traits, again, it's just looking at the leader themselves. And that if we really want to come up with a theory of leadership, we need to stop just looking at the leaders and start looking at a broader picture. So these theories take into account situation or contextual variables, and that had not been done up to this point. So all the focus on leadership until the contingency theories was simply either the traits or the behaviors of the leaders. The best two known contingency theories that are still somewhat supported and used today is Fiedler's contingency theory, and then House's path-goal theory. So I think also path-goal theory gets the award of being designed by probably one of the coolest looking IO psychologists. An eye patch always adds a little bit of authenticity, I think, to the ruggedness of an industrial organizational psychologist. So we're going to talk about Fiedler's contingency theory first. Both of these are fairly popular because they bring in the idea of the context of leadership in a fairly simple way that makes it easy for managers and for business professionals to kind of visualize the idea of how do we predict good leadership and how do we foster good leadership. So Fiedler's contingency theory. Effective leadership is a joint function of the leader's characteristics and situational features. So that's it sounds pretty common sense to today's eyes, but this was fairly groundbreaking. The idea that we do want to know what the leader's traits are, we do want to know how the leader behaves, but then we need to ask, what is the situation that leader is in? So this is the first leadership theory to consider how leader characteristics might interact with situational variables to determine leadership effectiveness. Remember also that the limitations of trait theory was they were fairly successful at determining who would emerge as a leader. They were not as successful at determining who would be effective as a leader. The behavioral theories generally kind of came up with this thought that the more you focus on task and social, the more successful you are, but there was still a fair amount of studies that were finding people that were high on task, high on social, that weren't effective leaders. So this is the first one to say, well, both of those are important, but we also need to ask, what is the actual situation the leader is in if we want to be able to predict effectiveness, whether that leader is actually influencing subordinates to increase organizationally relevant goals. So Fiedler's contingency theory looks at situational favorability, the function of a leader's perception of situational control. So this is defined by the leader-member relations, the task structure, and the position power. So the idea here is that the first thing that you want to actually get an idea of, if you're going to actually determine if someone's going to be an effective leader, is what kind of relationships does that leader have? How much task structure is there to begin with? In other words, is the organization doing tasks that are very unstructured? So an unstructured task might be the creation of a brand new product or the creation of a new movie. It's a very unstructured process in that there's a lot of creativity involved. A very high structured task would be something that is very clearly defined, like building an engine for a car. It's pretty clear what's being done there. And finally, does the leader have position power? The degrees of situational favorability match up with a leadership style or orientation measured by a least preferred coworker scale. Now, this is actually the limitation of this study, is most of the actual measurement of Fiedler's contingency theory is being done by actually having people list who is their least preferred coworker. The idea behind this was that by measuring what your reactions were to the person that you like working with least gives us a pretty good idea of what kind of situation that organization is. So the responses to this theory are fairly mixed. So there is some support for this theory in some areas. It's a very easy and kind of common sense theory once we actually walk through the model of it. However, there's not support for some of its predictions. So here it is, the first way to think about it, and we're going to look at it in two different models. So the idea is that basically each one of these puts us down a series of paths. So what we want to measure to determine if someone's going to be a good leader is we first want to know is what is the leader membership relations like. So that's that least preferred coworker scale. So are they high or are they low? Next is task structure. Is the task that the group or the organization doing, is it very highly structured or is it very lightly structured? Does the person have position power? And finally, is the situational favorability, the control over the situation, high to low? So the idea here is that if you have high relations with your employees, the task structure is high, and then regardless of your position power, if the situational favorability is high, what you want is low LPC leaders. These leaders become more relationship oriented here. So the idea here is that there already is a good relationship between the leaders and the followers. The task structure is clearly defined, and the leader may have positive or have high or low position power, but the situational favorability, the situational control is that the people that are doing the job have control and they're doing well. So if you have an organization that's doing well, you want someone that's going to be more relationship oriented. In other words, they're focusing on just the little things in the organization to make it that much more pleasant. Now let's look at the far other end of the spectrum. Now you've got low relations. In other words, the management or the leadership and the subordinates is not really a good relationship. There's a lot of negativity there. The task structure is low, so people aren't sure how to actually get the task done. In this case, again, if we have low position power, the person really isn't even recognized as a leader, and the situational favorability is low. At that point, no structure at all, so we need task-oriented leaders. In that situation, we don't want someone that's social, we want someone that's task. In other words, the only person that's going to succeed when there's already negative feelings towards management, there's an ambiguous task, and there's not a lot of power, and the situational favorability in the organization. In other words, generally the feeling in the organization is fairly low. That's when we're going to need a task-oriented leader. Those two far ends of this theory are fairly well supported. Generally speaking, if you're in a situation where the company is basically bad in almost every one of these, it's got bad leader-member relationships, the task structure is low, not a lot of position power, and the situational favorability, basically the overall atmosphere of the organization is bad. The only kind of leader that's going to succeed in that kind is the leader that can actually basically dictate and take control to provide support for that organization to move forward. But likewise, if you have a situation where the organization is doing great, then you need a more relationship-oriented leader in that situation. So in the middle ground is where this theory predicts that relationship orientation works here. So basically a high LPC leadership. Relationship-oriented works here because lots of potential conflict. So the low LPC leadership style. Hold on for a second. So at the end of the day, the leadership style of Fiedler's contingency theory is that basically there's two types of leader. The low LPC leader is going to either be a task-oriented leader or a relationship-oriented leader. And it's going to basically focus on whichever of those two are needed in the situation. And a high LPC leader is always going to be relationship-oriented. And they're going to be more useful in those middle situations. Now, again, the theory really isn't strongly supported as far as that. So when you think about it also, as far as the theory, when we go through this chart, high, low, high, low, high, low, we end up with 8 potential situations. But the theory only has really 2 different types of leaders that are actually resulting in how you would function in these situations. Fiedler's contingency theory is often viewed as, or basically represented by a graph like this. So again, the leader effectiveness is on the vertical axis, and the situational control is on the horizontal axis. And again, a low LPC leader is one that's more focused on production, but they are somewhat adaptable too, depending on the situation. And again, what is predicted here is if there is low control or high control, those low LPC leaders are going to be better. So if there's a low amount of control, the low LPC leader are highly effective under low situational control. In other words, they're going to really focus on the task and they're going to try to get things done. But also, if there's a high level of situational control, the low LPC leaders are highly effective under this high situational control because the situation is already set up to focus on the task. Therefore, it allows them to adapt themselves to being more relational. Now, the high LPC leaders are very naturally focused on the relationships. They have a very high concern for people. They're not going to be very successful when there's very little situational control, and in some ways they're not going to be really effective when there's high situational control. Where they are supposed to shine is when there's moderate control. In other words, the organization is not failing, which is the left end of this spectrum, but it's also not succeeding yet, which is the right end of the spectrum. So this theory suggests that that's when people that are focusing on managing conflicts and focusing on people are going to be more successful. So path-goal theory is an alternate, and it was developed by House in 1971, and it basically is an adaptation of Victor Vroom's expectancy theory of motivation. It specifies situational moderators that influence the leader behaviors and leader effectiveness relationship. And it basically says there's 4 leader behaviors: directive behavior, achievement-oriented behavior, supportive behavior, and precipitative behavior. So the situational modifiers, so the way this works is you first have your leader behaviors. So the leader behaviors can be directive, so that's similar to the authoritarian style. You're basically just directing people, this is what I want you to do. They can be achievement-oriented. In other words, I'm trying to encourage you to achieve, maybe providing rewards, providing punishments for failure. Basically, I'm trying to get people to achieve. It can be supportive, which is going more towards the social end. So I try to support my workers, I try to support my subordinates, and finally precipitative, which would be precipitative, which would be similar to the democratic style of Levin. So the top 2 are more task-oriented. They're about authoritarian leadership styles, and they're also about trying to motivate people through offers of achievement. The bottom 2 are more social, about either supporting the people and treating them well, or involving them in the decision-making. So those leadership behaviors are then going to be interacted by the situational moderators. So what are the subordinate characteristics? Do those subordinates have self-esteem issues? If they do, maybe a supportive style is necessary. Do they have a high need for achievement? Then an achievement orientation or orientated style would be necessary. Also, the environmental characteristics. So what are the tasks that are being done, and what is the authority system? Now, once you actually determine what the situational modifiers are to determine what leadership behaviors will be more successful, you then determine if they actually have effect on the subordinate based on Victor Vroom's motivational theory of expectancy. Do the subordinates what are their subordinates' expectancies and values? So in other words, do they value achievement? Do they value the task being done? What is valuable to them? And finally, if you match the leadership behaviors to the situational moderators, taking into account what the subordinates value, that will result in subordinate satisfaction, subordinate effort, and subordinate performance. Research support has been shown for basic propositions. However, results for predicting performance and those involving supportive behaviors are much less consistent. So what's been found is that each one of the links in path-goal theory has some support. But it's still a fairly complex theory. So the theory has not been well tested. There are methodological problems and a lack of attention to intermediate variables. So I'm going to back up here for just a second. And again, going back to that graph that we just left, what that basically means is that every single one of those elements in the previous slide, in order for us to use that model, we need to be able to measure each one of those behaviors, each one of those environmental or situational variables. We need to measure the subordinates' expectancies, and finally we need to be able to measure their actual performance. And that's one of the criticisms, is this particular theory is a pretty good model for leadership behavior and contingency of leadership behavior, but it really isn't a very applied or functional model. So now we're going to briefly talk about some of the more contemporary theories. So in the past 30 years, new leadership theories have emerged. They include leader-member exchange theory, implicit leadership theory, and transformational leadership theory. And we're going to talk about leadership-member exchange and implicit memory leadership theory right now. So leader-member exchange theory, LMX, is a very popular theory that's still being used today to kind of, this one's a little bit less about predicting leadership and a little bit more about trying to determine when a leader is going to be effective. So the focus is on the unique dyadic relationships between subordinates and leaders. In other words, what it tries to measure is what is the overall quality of the relationships the leader has with each and every one of their subordinates. And it recognizes that leaders have different relationships with different subordinates. And generally this breaks down into subordinates are either in the in-groups or the out-groups. In other words, every leader will tend to have preferred subordinates and less preferred subordinates. The in-group subordinates generally have better relationships with the leader. There's usually more mutual trust, and there's usually more shared responsibility and support for those individuals. The out-group subordinates are treated in a more task-oriented fashion. So what this suggests is that almost all leaders change the types of leadership styles they use based on the subordinates they're dealing with. That most leaders do have the ability to be both focused on task and social, but they tend to only use both of those traits with their in-groups. And they tend to more focus on just task orientation or task focus with their out-groups. So research does support the idea that the quality of leader-follower relationships are predictive of both individual, group, and organizational level outcomes. And what this really refers to is what you're looking for is how much work is a leader putting into those actual individual dyadic relationships. So the quality of relationships with the boss can affect the work experience in a very positive way. So the more positive relationship you have with the leader, the more likely on an individual level you're going to be doing more for the company. Your groups may work more, which results in organizational level outcomes. Research has found that demographic and organizational factors do affect LMX development. There's research that's found gender dissimilarity. So basically, if you have a male leader, he is more likely to form in-groups with other males and less likely to form in-groups with females, and vice versa, that females are more likely to form in-groups with other female subordinates than males. The number of subordinates definitely affects this, so the more subordinates you have, the more likely you're going to see this in-group and out-group effect. And also, to some degree, the employee workload will have an influence on this kind of an effect. So the leader, followers' relationships impact employee attitudes and organizational outcomes. So it's the leader-follower relationships, this interaction between not only the leader's behaviors, but also how he interacts with the followers, that is more likely to be able to predict organizational outcomes. So from an organizational consultant viewpoint, LMX theory is, again, you do a baseline. You're going to measure what is the relationship between the leaders and their followers. How big of a difference is there between how the leader interacts with his in-group and his out-group? And how can we bring it to where maybe we don't have it to where everyone's in the in-group, but the difference between the treatment of the in-group and out-group is lesser, is reduced? Then that is going to result in better relations across all subordinates, which will result in better organizational outcomes. Implicit leadership theory emphasizes the subordinates' perceptions of leader behaviors. Leadership as the outcome of perceptual process involving leaders and subordinates. The idea here is that it's not so much what type of leader you are, as what type of leader your subordinates expect you to be. So the idea here is that every individual subordinate has a prototype, a mental representation of what they think a leader is. And leadership effectiveness is more about the followers' perceptions of the leader's actions than the leader's actions. So the idea here is that if you have a group of people that expect leaders to be very authoritarian, they're going to respond better to an authoritarian leader. If you have a bunch of subordinates that expect leadership to be very democratic, they're going to respond better to a democratic leadership. In other words, this is flipping it on its, basically flipping all the theories we've talked about so far 180 degrees. We're now focused not on the leader, but the actual perceptions. And what's also interesting about implicit leadership theory is it leads to some interesting questions about, do people's perceptions of what a good leader is, do they change, and do they change often, and are they influenced by things outside the organization? So implicit leadership theory and leadership ratings are basically presented by this following model. So we start with A. We have an effective leader prototype. So we determine, as this is again the subordinates. The subordinates decide, this is what I think a leader is. And in this case, I've listed intelligent, excellent communication skills, committed, and a self-starter. So that is the perception of the subordinates of what they think a leader is. Then B is the actual leader. Jared is the leader of this work team, and his behaviors are, he's intelligent, he is excellent at communication skills, and he's committed, but he's not a self-starter. So what happens after that is we now match the leadership traits and behaviors that we as subordinates view in our actual leader to our prototype or stereotype of what a leader should be. And the more it matches, the more we get that the leader evaluation is an effective leader. The less it matches, the more likely our leader evaluation is that that person is a poor leader. And then finally we get to D, rating behaviors using global impression. So is Jared a self-starter? Well, he's an effective leader, therefore he's a self-starter. So what's important here is that once we decide that someone matches our prototype enough that we think they're an effective leader, it also feeds back to our perceptions now include traits that we think are associated with effective leaders that we used to not think was associated with that person. That may sound a little complex. Let me try this again. What that means is that once someone has enough leadership behaviors for them to be a close enough match to our belief of what a good leader is, we will fill in the gaps in their skills. In other words, if they have some skills that they're missing from good leadership, once we decide we think they're a good leader, we will start to rate them as also having those skills. Think of it as halo effect when we were talking about performance appraisal. This theory has been fairly well supported. So basically what you can do is you can actually measure the traits of a leader before he's ever actually in a leadership position. Measure what the effective leadership prototypes are of a group of subordinates, and then have that leader come into that situation and start leading. If the people acknowledge this person's close enough, yep, they're a good leader, they will start to attribute to that leader traits that that leader doesn't actually have, if those traits are associated with their perceptions of an effective leadership prototype. So that is the implicit leadership theory. But like I said, one of the more interesting things about this theory is it's very much focused on the A. What is the prototype of leadership? So this leads me to one of the more interesting studies that I've ever actually done as far as leadership studies, and that was a leadership study of the perceptions of what traits are necessary or who is associated with being a good leader. So this data was collected on different dates. So the dates we collected data on this is, so once was on the 37th anniversary of Martin Luther King's assassination, the spring of 2008. So all we did is we actually asked a bunch of students to just simply list who were the top 5 people they thought of as leaders, and what were the top 5 traits that leaders needed to have. And then we did the same thing a little bit later in that year, at the height of the 2008 Democratic-Republican primary race. So at this point, the focus of political discourse and news was very much on the Republican Party. And finally, in the fall of 2008, we did an additional data collection, same questions, name 5 leaders, and also name the 5 important traits of leaders, right after the election of Barack Obama. So we found some interesting effects. So time 1 is the dark band, time 2 is the blue band, and time 3 is the purple band. So this is just the top leaders by the time period. So the most commonly listed leader during time 1, which was on the anniversary of Martin Luther King, was Martin Luther King. But that's kind of interesting because that's who people are thinking of as a leader at that point. That's the first person that's coming to their mind. Number 2 was John F. Kennedy, which was also the president during that period. Notice that everyone else that's on this list, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Oprah Winfrey, Bill Gates, fairly low. Time 2 was when the Republican Party was very much in the news. Now, Martin Luther King is still on the list at this point, maybe some carryover effects of news stories, but suddenly now it's George W. Bush that's being listed as an effective leader. This was also right at the time that there was some good positive news about the war in Iraq, so he was kind of running right towards the end of his presidency. He had gotten a bump in his popularity. Now notice time 3, right after the election of Barack Obama is clearly being listed as one of the main people are thinking of as leaders. What's more interesting is, again, let's look at the areas of influence. So civil rights was very much, the leaders that were considered to be civil rights leaders were at the height at time 1. Politicians were the height of time 2, and actually politicians were the main people we were thinking of leaderships at all 3 times. The top traits, I think, is pretty interesting. So at time 1, which is the time when people were mainly thinking of civil rights leaders, still politicians, but Martin Luther King was definitely the most commonly mentioned person as a leader. Let's look at the traits that were most important. Charisma, communication, and aggression were all fairly high. Smarts and rich and famous were fairly low. Time 2, when the Republican Party and President George Bush Jr. were the main people thought of as an example of a good leader, and right after the announcement of some successful military news, notice aggression is now almost off the chart. It is the main thing people are thinking of as a top trait associated with leadership. Charisma is still on there. Communication is towards the bottom. Intelligence is pretty low. Rich and famous pretty low. Time 3, we see again this spread. What this indicates from implicit leadership theory is that our prototypes of leadership are strongly affected by current events, who's in the news, and the people that we're thinking of as leaders from moment to moment, which means that kind of gives us some information that leadership is a very fluid process. So a leader that was very aggressive at the time when aggressive leaders were the prototype people thought of when they were asked to think about who are good leaders would be viewed as more successful in that time. However, that same leader would be viewed as much less successful later in time when that is no longer a trait being associated with top leadership.